Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Good afternoon and welcome to PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Chad Dion Lassiter, and I'm excited this afternoon on this wonderful sun-filled Sunday to have with us the Director of Fair Housing, Adrian Garcia, and our Director of Enforcement, Jinada, Rochelle. Our topic today is, what is an assistance animal and their importance? But before we get started, briefly, Jinada, share with us how many years you've been with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and in what capacities?
Well, I've been with the commission for 13 years. So I first started off as an investigator, looking at employment cases, and then moved to housing cases. And then I became a supervisor, supervising people investigating cases in housing and in employment. And then I moved over into our central office, working as the assistant to the former director, and now as the Director of Enforcement, where I oversee both part of the housing contract as well as our employment cases and monitoring those cases and internal training.
Wow. Stuff. And Adrian, you're one of our new employees as our new Director of Fair Housing, but you are not new to the space of housing advocacy. Could you briefly share with our viewing audience the work that you did prior to coming to the state?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. I was the director of the Housing Equality and Equity Institute for a nonprofit in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that is known as Lancaster Housing Opportunity Partnership. In that capacity, what I wanted to do and what I think we did was bring to life what fair housing is around the context of who it affects and who are those that could help advocate and that could also learn from it and benefit from that experience. So that would be lenders, social service providers, landlords, property management companies, pretty much anyone that touches housing. And so we set out to educate and inform landlords and all those people that I mentioned earlier, just so that we had a more informed community and we could reduce the discrimination in housing. So you kind of bring people along, not by preaching at them, as I would say in the past, but by making them part of the solutions that would provide for equitable housing.
Okay, great. So for our viewing audience, this is going to be a teachable Sunday for you. It's also going to be a teachable Sunday for me as the host of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century, because I don't have any knowledge whatsoever as it pertains to assistance animal and their importance. And so that's why we have two really distinguished individuals in Adrian and Jinada that's going to help us in the moment. So Adrian, what is an assistant animal and what is the importance of an assistant animal? And the back part of that question is, what are some commonly known assistant animals?
Okay, so for the purposes of our conversation and in the interest of time, we're going to include the assistance animal, like a CNI dog or a seizure dog. We're going to include those, and of course, emotional support animals. We're going to put them in the same umbrella because the rules apply for both, okay? And so the assistance animal or emotional support animal is an animal that allows the individual with a disability to enjoy their housing like everyone else would, everyone else that wouldn't require any reasonable accommodation. So that means that if you're a person that has an emotional disability or a mental disability, and the emotional support animal allows you to remain calm and to enjoy your dwelling, then that's what that animal is there to do. And then on the backside, basically some of the animals that you'll find are obviously cats and dogs. Other less common are birds, hamsters, rabbits could also be. The new regulations say any domesticated animal is used in that capacity.
Wow, thank you. Jinada, what are the obligations of housing providers as it relates to persons who may need a reasonable accommodation? In addition to that, why are there housing providers who refuse these reasonable accommodations?
Well, the housing providers have an obligation to grant their reasonable accommodation. So when someone presents to them the information that says, hey, I need this animal to alleviate the symptoms of my disability, the housing provider has to engage in what we call the interactive process, meaning seeing what they can do to grant the reasonable accommodation. So when it comes to assistance animals, the easiest thing and what they have to do is to allow the tenant to have that service or assistance animal to, as Adrian said, enjoy the housing, to live in the housing as if someone who did not need the assistance animal. And so most of the times when housing providers say no, it's usually because one or two things. One, they don't believe the person and they don't believe the documentation that they provided. They say it doesn't have to be from their medical provider. And two, they often cite a financial reason, meaning their insurance company will say, hey, it's a particular breed, and so we're not going to insure you, so you can't have that tenant be there. But again, they have to make an individual assessment, and they have to allow the person to have that animal, regardless of maybe increased insurance costs, regardless of whether they don't think it's real. They have to do what is necessary for that person to enjoy the housing.
Wow. I'm glad that you were able to sparse that out for our viewing audience. So with the landlord, they may not think that it's real. They may think that it's perceived or imagined. But in fact, with the documentation and with the context, they have to accommodate individuals.
Yes, that is absolutely correct.
Wow. Thank you. Adrian, what does the Fair Housing Act say about reasonable accommodation as it pertains to assistant animals?
As it pertains to, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I, didn't memorize the regulation, but basically it says if you're in need of a reasonable accommodation with an emotional support animal or a service animal, then you just request it. Number one, you request it from your landlord, and it doesn't state anything about having it in writing. Okay, you can do it verbally. I have always recommended, hey, send an email, send a text, just say, hey, I'm going to need a service animal. And so many landlords that are up on their fair housing will say, okay, well, listen, I have this form that if you wouldn't mind taking to your provider, I'm not asking for diagnostic. I'm just confirming the fact that it is a need. And then when I get that back, no problem. That should be how it goes. And that's basically what the fair housing says. The other thing that is also within the fair housing language is that the emotional support animal is a direct extension of the individual with the disability. And as such, it is not subject to any pet fees. It is not subject to any pet rent. So that's very important to also know.
Yeah, that is important to know. So Adrian, I want to stay with you for a moment. If you could just elaborate a little bit more as it relates to the aspect of once someone is in violation, share with our audience briefly what they should do.
If you believe that you've been turned down for an emotional support animal, you can obviously contact us at the state. You can also seek one of the housing advocates in your area as well. Many times you'll be working with someone, and I say this because in my past experience, many of the people that have emotional support animals have a system of support, and they will go to that system of support. So I would encourage you to go to your service provider and say, hey, I've asked for this, I'm not getting it, and I believe this is against the law, but I'm not sure, can you help me? So seek out someone that'll help you. Most landlords, not all, will understand what a reasonable accommodation is. They don't like it, and they will avoid trying to use it, but they know what it is, and they know they must adhere. There are some exceptions out there with very individual mom and pop landlords that just aren't up on it. And so that's where you might find that more often than not.
Okay, thank you. Jinada, we want to spend some time with you just educating us on the aspect of, because we can't always see a disability with the naked eye, does not mean it doesn't exist. Can you speak to that context?
Sure. What I have experienced and seen a lot of times is because We as a society, we still have this issue with people with mental disabilities we can't see because we think it's not real. And we think, well, they look okay, so they must be okay. Well, that's not the truth. My neighbor isn't going to come up to me and say, hey, you know what? I suffer from manic depression or schizophrenia or something like that. There's no sign that says, hey, I have this. So that way you'll know that I need this. So I think that's a larger issue. And we just have to be sensitive because it's not real to you. Because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it's not real to that other person, to that tenant, to that person buying the home, to the person wanting to rent somewhere. It is just as real to them as someone who has a disability that you can see, someone who you can see is blind, someone you can see is in a wheelchair or using some other physical assistance. But it's just as real. And I would argue it's even more real than what we can see because we know we have soldiers coming back who have PTSD. We have our first responders now in the midst of the COVID crisis. You have nurses, you have doctors, you have all of these people suffering on the inside from an emotional trauma who may actually benefit from having an assistance animal. So we just have to realize because I can't see it, because it's not real to me, it doesn't mean that it's not real. It is very real for that particular person, and they need that assistance animal for them to enjoy their housing.
Wow. And thank you, Jinada, for bringing everything into context for the very moment we find ourselves in pertaining to COVID-19. That is so very real. I want to stay with you simply because Adrian spoke about the complaint process. Once a person or persons file, what can they expect next?
Well, their case is going to be assigned to an investigator. And so we as a state agency, we are very impartial. And I know people don't like to hear that. What we hear a lot is complainants or the people filing a complaint to say, hey, you favored my landlord, my real estate provider. And then we hear the opposite that says, hey, you favored the tenant, you favored the buyer, you favored all these other people. So, we're actually very neutral. So when both sides hate us, we feel like we're okay, we're doing our good job. So they'll get through the investigative process. And so what that entails is it could be an on-site where we go on site to see their property, to look how things are. How close are the apartments? Can you really hear the noise if something were to happen between them? Because sometimes we get a lot of noise complaints. We'll actually interview the prospective tenants. We may interview other tenants. We will look at application logs to see who applied, to see what rules were applied. We'll see if they have a reasonable accommodation policy. And a lot of times people don't, which is not good for them. You should have a reasonable accommodation policy that should line up with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Fair Housing Act. So we'll go through all of those things through the investigation to determine whether it's more likely than not that they were denied their assistance animal. The assistance animal has to be related to the person with a disability. So we'll go through all of those things and we will come to a conclusion to whether or not they violated our act.
Okay. Adrian, when we're looking at tenant-landlord conflict, whether it's pertaining to assistant animals or if it's just pertaining to just conflict in a broader sense, what are some of those landlord-tenant conflicts that you've experienced, Adrian, and what has been done to try to, mitigate those?
The one thing that both tenants and landlords have in common is our past experiences. So if you've had bad relationships with landlords in the past, you will enter this new relationship with that mentality. Landlord will have the same baggage he's bringing to this new relationship. And unfortunately, because of that baggage, there's always an incredible mistrust of each other. And so what we've tried to do in some of the education classes that we've held in the past is to try and get beyond that and say, listen, this is a new relationship. Look at this relationship as a one-all. In other words, it's me and you, not me and 50 other people that you've run into and have had bad experiences with in the past.
Certainly.
We need to basically come to the common ground and say, this is what I know about my situation. This is what you know about your situation. Let's just go off of that. And so that is one of the bad things about the landlord and tenant relationship. Also, lack of understanding of fair housing laws, of property maintenance codes. As a landlord, you are in a disadvantage because you've gotten into an industry that you did not go to school for in many occasions, that you did not have a mentor for in many occasions. And you've entered it because you thought, okay, some disposable income, maybe I inherited this property, and that's fine. But there are rules and regulations that you must follow in order to be able to be successful at being a landlord. Tenants have the same deficiency. They must learn how they can navigate that landlord and tenant relationship. What is it that I have to do to become a desirable, informed, proactive tenant? And so that means learning what your rights are. That means knowing how to exercise your rights in a manner that is understandable, clear, succinct, successful. And also, what's even more important is knowing what the expectations of caring for a property are, right? And of course, paying your rent. We have found that in many of the surveys that I've held with landlords and property managers, that when I ask them, what is a good tenant for you, they come back and say, well, yeah, good credit is important, but I just want somebody to talk to me. So communication came to be one of the top 3 things that attracted a landlord to a successful tenant: communication.
Wow. Jinada, same question for you, but just a little bit different. When we're looking at the landlord-tenant relationship, other than the aspect that Adrian, you just gave a bulk of just great information for our viewing audience, other than the defined thing that we always want, which is pay your rent on time, what are some of the other ingredients that go into a really solid tenant-landlord relationship, Jinada?
I think Adrian hit it when he said communication, because we get a lot of complaints on what we would say are terms and conditions, meaning I asked for something and they didn't get back to me. You know, so it's important that you do that. When I do training with property managers and landlords, I'm like, look, your name is your reputation. So if you want people to say you're a good person to do business with, you're going to respond to them. But if you don't care, then just be a poor landlord to everyone. Don't answer anybody's calls. Don't fix anything. Don't do anything. But I understand that that's not who you are. So make sure you are communicating with your tenants. If they ask you something, respond to them. Don't just ignore them because they get on your nerves today. Make sure you're actually talking to them. And then for tenants, you know, it's about setting expectations. You know, setting expectations. They are your landlord. They are not your spouse. They don't have to respond to you within 30 seconds. If it's someone who's got multiple properties, it may take a little bit before they get back to you.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Expectations, yes. Maybe a light bulb is out and they won't fix it right now compared to someone whose toilet is leaking. That is going to be more important. So just set those expectations and always, you know, pay your rent on time. If you have issues, you have concerns, make sure you're letting them know, because the reality is keeping someone in is good for business. Having to go through the eviction process is bad for business for both the landlord and the tenant. So those are just some things that I think that people can do to make their relationship better.
Great. Communication and expectations, really 2 great ingredients. Adrian, one thing you would like our viewing audience to know about assistant animals and the persons that need them?
The one thing that I think is most important is that at any time, any person can become a person within a protected class. Disability is becoming an increasing larger protected class. The trauma of what's going on today, things that are happening with our soldiers upon their return, individuals re-entering society from incarceration, and many of them with emotional and mental disabilities that require a service animal. This is not a segment of the population. This is not something where you could actually say, this won't happen to me. If you're healthy today and tomorrow you spike up to a 500 blood sugar, guess what? Now you have diabetes.
Yeah.
And you may need an assistance dog that will be able to gauge when your sugar drops or when it elevates, so that assistance animal takes action. At any moment, any one of us could enter a protected class. We must not think about this as in terms of this won't happen to me. It will happen to you, it will happen to a family member, and we need to be informed and engaged as to this topic.
Thank you. Fair housing means so much. one of the things we do here on PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century, is we try to drill it down to one word. So when you're looking at, Jinada, the phraseology, fair housing, what's one word that comes to mind for you?
Essential.
Wow, powerful word. Same thing for you, Adrian. One word that describes fair housing for you.
Equity.
Essential and equity. Okay. Jinada, as we're coming to a close, provide some advice that you would give someone who may want to enter into the fair housing advocacy space. We know that there are a lot of young individuals and just individuals in general who really fundamentally believe, like you and Adrian and so many of our colleagues at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and other housing advocacy providers, that housing is essential. It's about equity. It's about, creating generational wealth, that no one should be discriminated against because of housing. Landlords should not engage in sexual coercion if a person is behind on their rent, and so many other things. What advice would you give a viewer or anyone that may see this in the future who may be on the fringe or may be saying to themselves, I want to become a fair housing advocate?
I would say don't get weary in well-doing and be in it for the long haul. Because as you know, we had the Kerner Act, we've had the Fair Housing Act for 51 years, and things don't appear to look as if they're getting any better. So don't get discouraged by the larger aspect of fair housing and we're still fighting. Take some of the smaller wins that you can get and say, you know what? I was able to advocate for this over here. And now we see a whole segment of population who are no longer homeless or living in substandard housing. Take those small wins, because those small wins are going to encourage you when you're looking at the larger scheme, when you're looking at, large housing projects still with lead paint and lead pipes and saying, we need to fix this. So take those smaller wins and say, you know what, I was able to advocate for this person, this thing over here, and use that to sustain you as we continue the larger fight for fair housing across the Commonwealth and across the nation.
Wow, that would be sound advice. Same thing for you, Adrian. Some advice that you would give someone who's contemplating joining the fair housing advocacy space.
I mean, there's the obvious connection to organizations that are connected to, say, the PHRC. We have councils across the state, so they can join a PHRC advisory council. That's one way. They can also take those small wins. There are various committees in your township and boroughs or in your cities. You have people that are on lead commissions. You have people that are on property maintenance advisory groups. You are people that are part of the county planning in your area. And I always say housing is everything and everything is housing. There is not an aspect that is out there that is not touching upon housing. When you see someone or a developer trying to develop housing, instead of going there and fighting against housing that is absolutely needed in order to expand the inventory so that more affordable housing is available, then don't go and protest against it. Go there, learn about it, and ask questions. And so what we're finding across the state is that we're having people fight against housing when they don't understand the ramifications behind it. And many times, unbeknownst to them, the reason they fight is linked to discrimination. So you want to be careful about what you're fighting against and become more educated. So if you really want to be an advocate for housing, that's one way. The other way is that if you're living in a housing complex, now that you know a little bit more about what you've learned today, you can look some of this up, educate your neighbors, have tenant potlucks and talk about fair housing. Is anyone having an issue? Become a real advocate. And then also through your social service providers, through your friends, through your church, someone's always connected to housing. So just kind of spread the word that way, and that makes you an advocate in your community.
Yeah, really good advice. Jinada, before we close, I wanted to come back to you, because when I think about housing and I think about disciplines, and we titled this show, PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century, maybe a 21st century macro, meso, and micro level of looking at housing. I wanted to throw out the following disciplines to you. maybe we should be looking for folk who have backgrounds in ethnography, urban design, anthropology, sociology, individuals who are counselors, therapists, social workers, people who, I remember when we initially did our show with Stella Adams, she talked about algorithms and people who are good with mathematics and things of that nature. What do you think about those disciplines being integrated into the recipe for a fair housing advocate, Jinada?
I think those are essentials because you're talking about your city planners. You're talking about how you're going to manage as you go forward, as the population may grow in your particular area. So you need all of those things. You need people to look in the environment and say, if we put an apartment complex over here, what is in the water over here? What is that going to affect? How is that going to affect the sewer system down over here? Is it near an incinerator? Is it near a dump? Is it near all those things? So you need people who can actually look at that and plan a city out and say, okay, no, we can't put it over here because this is what happens. If we put it over here, now we need to add increased money for other facilities because we're going to need to improve the roads. So you need engineers to look at those things. So all those things are so essential to housing and what we're doing. As we expand, we need to expand correctly so that everyone has an opportunity to sit at the table, so that everyone has an opportunity to better themselves. You know, we as a nation are great at individualizing things. So in order to help the individual, we need to get some planning together. We need to make sure that we are setting them up for success when it comes to their housing. So look at all of those things, those economic things, those building things, all that, like what's in the dirt, what's in the ground, to figure out, can we actually put something there? Is it going to create another problem? Are we going to get a Flint, Michigan? Are we going to get some of the areas in Shenandoah that we have here in Pennsylvania? Are we going to get some of those things, the residue from the coal mines, those things? Those were great industries, but sometimes they have some bad residual effects. So we need to make sure we're looking at all the information as we're planning housing to move forward into the next century.
Thank you so much, Jinada. If you're failing to plan, you're planning to fail, and we're planning to be successful. As we close, Adrian, look into the camera with regards to our viewing audience and leave them with whatever message you want to leave them with as it relates to our topical discussion on this wonderful sun-filled Sunday.
I want to tell those that are renting, those that are purchasing a home, no one is doing you any favors. You've earned the right to rent without discrimination. You've earned the right to buy without discrimination. So, you know, learn everything that there is to know about the processes of buying a home, the lending, about renting, any rental classes that are out there. Pursue those, get yourself educated, and remember that when you're in that relationship, especially that rental relationship, you are buying something or you're renting that property, but no one's doing you any favors. You're paying for a service, and it's okay for you to feel empowered to say, hey, I have a problem with this roof leaking. Many cases, tenants won't complain about those things. So no one's doing you any favors. You're paying for a service. It's okay for you to feel empowered to ask for someone to respond for what you're paying for. The same thing on the lending side. You know, don't get caught in a trap.
Thank you. Jinada, look into the camera. Whatever words that you want to leave with our viewing audience, please do so.
Just remember that fair housing is essential. You know, you have a right to live where you can afford to live, and no one should tell you you can't live there because of your disability, because of your sex, because of your age, your color, or any of those reasons. If you can afford it, you should be able to have it. And housing just makes life so much easier when you have safe, affordable housing. You can rest easy at night. So I just want to encourage everyone to seek the housing that they can afford, make sure that they actually can afford it, and then just go for it. Go for it. Don't let anyone or anything stop you and tell you that you cannot or you don't have a right to be there, because you do.
Thank you so much, Jinada. And as we end, to our viewing audience, if you have internet access, please Google things like the Kerner Commission. Please Google things like the assistance of animals, as well as support animals, and all of the things that you've heard from these two brilliant housing advocates and advocates for justice on behalf of everyone in the Commonwealth on every side of the color line and every side of the gender line. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Sunday with PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century with Adrian Garcia, with Jinada Rochelle. And please make sure that you go to our Facebook account, our Twitter account, all of our social media, but as important, so that if you're a victim of some form of unlawful discrimination, you can file a complaint on our website, which is www.phrc.gov. Thank you so much, and we'll see you the first Sunday in the month of August. Take care.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.